Hey everyone, welcome John.
Hi everyone.
Yep, you'll introduce yourself, I guess.
I'm John Epler, and today I'll be doing presentation, playing a story, collaborative narrative. Is there anything else that we need to talk about, or should I just jump right in?
Yeah, just jump right in. And also, I want to remind everyone that you can ask your questions during the lecture, and I will read them to the speaker after the lecture during the Q&A.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. As mentioned, I'm John Epler. This is the presentation called Playing a Story About Collaborative Narrative. Now, who am I exactly? Well, that's important. I'm John Epler. As mentioned, I'm narrative director of the Dragon Age franchise. I have been at BioWare for a very long time. Well, comparatively long time. Games industry career is average 5 years. I've been at BioWare for 13, so that makes me a grizzled vet, which, for being in my mid-30s is kind of a weird feeling. But I grew up playing a lot of PC RPGs. So back in the day, I played the Dark Sun games. I played a lot of MUDs, a lot of MMOs, and I just loved playing games. When I was a kid, my first choice was I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and then when I was told that wouldn't work out because I was too tall, I decided I wanted to be a game designer. But yeah, just generally played a lot of games my entire life. As I said, a focus on RPGs, but a little bit of everything. As mentioned, 13 years is a lot of games. I've worked at BioWare since 2007. My first game was Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. If you forgot that BioWare did a Sonic RPG, you're not alone. But it was a very good project for my first one because it was a very small team, comparatively speaking, which required a lot of different, I need to wear a lot of different hats, which for a term tester fresh out of university was pretty exciting and taught me a lot about game development. I worked on all the Dragon Age games. I've worked on Mass Effect 2, The Old Republic, Mass Effect Andromeda, Anthem. I've been in the industry for a long time, and in that time, I've worn a bunch of different hats. So I started at BioWare as a QA term tester, and a QA term tester is contract QA. So I was brought in to work on Sonic Chronicles, and like I said, I learned a lot in that project because, again, it was a small team. So one day I may be asked to help provide a little bit of support for the art team, a little bit of support for the design team. If you've ever seen any of my art, you know that art's not my calling, but sometimes they just need an extra set of hands to do something fairly menial. But again, this taught me a lot about how games are made and how all the pieces fit together. Then I moved into the cinematics department. So I moved into cinematics at the end of Mass Effect 2. They were looking for someone to take over the Joker conversations on the bridge, and they asked me if I wanted to do it. And since this was my first opportunity to do something, exciting that was going to get into the game and actually have my name on it, I probably put way more time and effort into those conversations than their importance necessarily necessitated, but I was proud of it, and it was an exciting time. Then I did cinematics on the Dragon Age games, starting with the Dragon Age Origins DLC, Witch Hunt. And then I moved into narrative presentation. Now, narrative presentation was a thing that we needed to realize was necessary because, again, narrative in games is not just about scenes. It's not just about cutscenes, about conversations. Narrative is about the entire game experience and how you tell the story through actions, through gameplay. And narrative presentation was the part of the job that ended up pulling those aspects together and trying to make something coherent and cohesive out of it. And spent a little bit of time in that. And now I am, as mentioned, the narrative director. What's narrative director? Well, narrative director spends a lot of their time in Outlook and meetings and conversations because, first of all, you're not a lead writer. You do some writing. I've done some writing before. I'll continue to do some writing in the future, but it's not the primary focus of my job. We have a lead writer for that. Our lead writer is the person who's in charge of the writing, making sure that the writing itself is good. I'm more in charge of a larger, more holistic view of narrative as a whole. So the cohesive narrative experience. And this is a job that requires a lot of communication, a lot of talking, a lot of negotiating, and working with different disciplines, because the important thing is narrative is not just a discipline related to writing. It's a more holistic approach to to the story of the game, as well as the experience of the game. And that requires, a lot more focus on, how gameplay works with it, how art works with it, how audio works with it. So my job is a lot of just talking to people from different departments and making sure everyone is aligned and pushing towards the same goal. Because again, writing in games is different. Some media is more auteur-driven. So if you're writing a novel, you're writing a short story, you're really only the person who's doing it yourself. There's obviously going to be collaborations. There's editing. There's you have a publisher, but ultimately you are writing the story, and you're not writing the story in a way that you have to worry about, oh, well, I don't know if my team can deliver on this part because it's too complicated. It's all about the words, and words are fairly cheap. Same thing, like I said, with short stories, but games are not that way, or at least they shouldn't be. That's not saying that some games aren't driven entirely by writing, but writing in games is more about the holistic experience and how those pieces work together. So you need to be more considerate, more thoughtful of how the other departments and the other groups work. And this is a thing that we find when people come into games from other mediums, they've been writing short stories, been writing novels, been writing plays for a while. It becomes a little bit of a shock. The more collaborative of an environment you were in previously, the less of a shock it is. So TV, movies, obviously those are mediums with a lot of requirements from different groups. Like, hey, we literally can't do that stunt, or hey, the CG is not going to allow that. But as you get more and more to games is the most collaborative in terms of the number of different things you have to keep in mind when you're doing this writing. And like I said, it is focused on the holistic experience. So for us, interdependence is critical. This is what we like to what we push on in our games. Writing is not writing the show. Writing is one piece of a larger whole. And for us, it's very important that our writers are in-house. And a lot of studios don't have in-house writers, so that's fine. It depends on what kind of game you're building. But for us, because our games are so focused on narrative, are so focused on story, we really like having our writers in studios so they can talk to other departments, other disciplines, and really come up with concepts and experiences that feel more cohesive. And that can be, not having your writers in-house can be a problem in either direction. Either you have a writer who comes in, big name writer, writes the entire story, hands it off, and then that's it. That's the experience. And then you're basically building a game around that. Or the other side of it is the entire game gets built, someone comes in and is told, write a story to fit this. And that's where you get a story that feels kind of out of touch with the gameplay experience and with the game that's being built. This can work in some games, in some situations, but for BioWare, it's not a thing that really works for the types of games we build. Because again, it is all connected. We don't have just one discipline running the show and narrative. Our narrative group is filled with a lot of different disciplines. We have level designers, level artists, character artists, animators, cinematics team, writers, etc. And these are all groups that work together to build this experience. Because again, each piece of content does demand a champion, but it's not always going to be a writer. It's not always going to be a level designer. If you're building a dungeon or you're building a piece of content that's more focused around the gameplay, that idea is largely going to come from gameplay or level design. And writing comes in after the fact to help to work with them to make it make sense. The champion, though, is that first person, that person who really had that idea for that piece of content. The flip side, if you're writing a story beat or you're writing a narrative mission, that's probably more likely to be the writer as a champion. But ultimately, it depends on what each piece of content is trying to say. Because again, as mentioned at the top of the slide, all of it's connected. All of this stuff needs to work together. And I think this is something where the best games out there do this. So this is true of AAA. This is true of indie. God of War is a great example of a game where the various pieces of the game felt like they worked together, like they were cohesive. This was a story about, taking your son up to the top of the mountain and then ultimately teaching your son about his destiny and about who he was, but also as Kratos, learning to come to terms with your new role as a father. And all the pieces of the game work together. You had abilities for Atreus, you had abilities for Kratos, and you had lots of different things that you did in this game that all tied into the core fantasy of Kratos. And it's how a game goes from, like I said, a game goes from good to great. Not every game is going to do this. And a game can be beautifully crafted and not hit that instant classic. In a lot of cases, it's because it doesn't have that necessarily that cohesive core to it. But again, indie games and AAA games have this in common where each individual part may be spectacular in isolation. There are games out there that are beautifully polished, that are just incredibly made, but you don't necessarily remember them 6 months later. You don't refer back to them as, remember that game I played. And it's not saying they're bad games. It's saying that they don't necessarily have that sensation of instant classic that you get from a game that does this cohesion so well, this narrative cohesion. Again, it doesn't make those games bad. And one thing I will say is any game that gets shipped, that gets actually made and is playable, that is a miracle in and of itself. Game development is hard, but it does mean that the games that this lack of cohesion can get in the way of the game as you try to solve the problems and you end up sometimes causing more problems. We've done this before at BioWare. This has definitely happened before in projects I've worked on. And you end up in a situation where you've ended up adding content, adding systems to fix problems that you caused because you lack that cohesion. So I'm going to speak about a few specific games now that I think do this exceptionally well. First game I can remember that did this, that I remember playing and thinking, holy smokes, this game is just so, this feels like everything that's working together, is Ultima 7. And Ultima 7 is a game I remember the first time I played it because I had a friend, and I think junior high at the time, whose dad worked in software development and who, as a result, always had new games kicking around. And he had Ultima 7. I remember plugging in it, turning it on, and just being blown away by how cohesive the experience felt. Like the first time I realized I could pick up anything in the world that wasn't nailed down. I could murder anyone in the world that I wanted to. I could play the Avatar the way I wanted to play the Avatar. And this was the game changer. This was a game that I didn't realize games could do this. And I think this is probably where I decided I really wanted to work in games, and specifically games that tell stories, games that have a strong narrative. Another studio that does this exceptionally well is From Software. And From Software, everyone, we all know Souls games, Bloodborne, Sekiro. They all have a lot of the same DNA. They are if you take screenshots from each one of these games, you put them side by side, you can see that they're made by the same studio, by the same developer. But each one has its own identity. If you play those games, you play each one side by side, you can see the difference. You can feel the difference in the way that those games are built. And part of that is because, again, they're cohesive. They know what they're building, and they lean into that hard. Souls games are the slowest of the three games. So they came out at a time where the joke in the industry was, oh, you want to make a game realistic, make it gray and brown. And Dark Souls was fairly gray and brown at the time. But again, nobody complained about that because it worked for the game that they were trying to build. It was a game about decay. It was a game about, the slow collapse of civilization. And that palette worked for the game. It was a key part of that experience. And the design of the game, everything that worked and that was built for that game worked together. It was a game about punishing aggression and rewarding caution. A lot of people play the game shield tank the entire thing. Obviously, Dark Souls 2 introduced power stancing, which for me at least made me a lot more aggressive and spent my time punching bad guys in the face rather than hiding behind a shield. But it still felt like a cohesive, coherent experience. Contrast that with Bloodborne. Bloodborne is a game that is about aggression. You play Bloodborne, and with the rally system, with the way the weapons work, the way the enemy counters work, this is a game that wants you to push, because ultimately Bloodborne is a game about being a hunter. You come into Yharnam, you wake up, and as far as you're aware, for about the first third of the game, you're there to kill beasts. They're werewolf type beasts, not exactly werewolves, but then things start to collapse and things start to fall apart. But even when the game shifts from that more gothic horror to more Lovecraftian horror, it still feels consistent, coherent, because they did such a good job of building the hunter fantasy and rewarding the hunter fantasy in every aspect of the game. And the art direction in this game is fantastic. Like I love seeing the shift from enemies like the cleric beast, Vicar Amelia, and then on the flip side you got Abritus, daughter of the cosmos, and you just see that distinction. But again, always leaning into the same core of you are a hunter, you're here to hunt beasts, and it's just that those beasts get way, way more messed up as you go through the game. And Sekiro is the third one. Sekiro is the one that, for me, I bounced off the hardest, and part of that's because I suck at parrying. And this was a game all about parrying, but it takes Bloodborne and flips it on the head. It is a game that largely focuses on you punishing enemy aggression. The parrying mechanic is so key to this game that it's all about baiting your enemy into attacks, baiting your enemy into moves, and then punishing them for them. And the encounters and enemies in this game are consistent with this aesthetic and this just design. It tells its story remarkably consistently. Even the story and the mechanic of rebirth and the cycle of life and death, they tie in together. They are part of the same whole. And this is why, again, all three From Software, the Souls games, Bloodborne, Sekiro, they're all good games. I would call them all fairly close, at least as a whole, classic games. And part of that's because they just know the game they're building and they lean into that hard. There's not a lot of extra cruft there. Another great example is the Stalker series. And anyone who's checked my Twitter knows that I love Stalker. Stalker is a game I will talk anyone's ear off at great length. But it's also the most cohesive game I've ever played, the most cohesive experience I've ever played, because it's all driving towards a single experience. There's not really a strong story. By which I mean there's not a lot of story. The story that's there is fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not about the story. It's about the narrative experience of being trapped in the zone, being trapped in this blasted radioactive hellscape. And every mechanic, every piece of audio and visual design plays into that. There's people who say, oh, the game looks kind of ugly, but of course it looks ugly in the parts where you're buried deep in the core, because it's supposed to be the world after the Chernobyl, it's the second Chernobyl disaster. It's just, it does this so well. And this is where, again, a thing is it's about the whole, not the sum of the parts. Because there are mechanics in Stalker that every other game I see them in, I absolutely hate. Weight limits. I love Dragon's Dogma. Another game I think is fantastic, but weight limits in that game drive me nuts. You spend lots of time just shoving objects back onto your pawns because you just don't have room to carry them yourself. Weapon Decay is another one. Breath of the Wild was a masterfully crafted game that almost pushed me off because trying to deal with the weapon decay meant that I was replacing my sword way more than I felt was in any way reasonable or appropriate. But in Stalker, they feel right because, again, these mechanics all tie into a very core feeling of the game, which is of course my gun's going to decay. I'm dragging it through swamps. I'm dragging it through radiation. Of course I need to pay somebody, in order to fix it. Of course I have weight limits because I can only take so many supplies out into these excursions into the dangerous zone. The rest sit back in the safe zone. All of this works together. All of this buttresses something else. And this comes to a point I want to make, which is the distinction between story and narrative. Story and narrative are not the same thing. Story is the core sequence of events that tell a specific set. You're trying to tell a story about loss, a story about regret. That doesn't mean that that's the narrative, though. The narrative is, not every game has a story, but every game does have a narrative. PUBG, DayZ are both multiplayer games that have narratives. PUBG's narrative is pretty straightforward. Battle Royale, you drop in, find a weapon, try to kill everyone who isn't you or your team. DayZ has a narrative. DayZ's narrative is about survival, and the entire game is based around that. You're going out scavenging for food, scavenging for weapons, ultimately trying to stay alive and survive in this harsh zombie apocalypse. A narrative is what you get when all the pieces fit together. So what does this actually mean practically? I've talked a little bit about the games, the games I think do this well, and it's really good to talk about story versus narrative, but what does this actually mean for how you get there? What's the process for getting there? How do you ensure that a game has a cohesive narrative? And I like I said, to spoil it, it's not easy. It is a constant process. Since I've moved into a more director role, my job is about working with people and making sure that everyone's talking to each other. A lot of people like to think, oh, you're narrative director. That means you're the guy who decides what the story is. Like, well, no, actually, no. I'm the guy who makes sure the story makes sense and makes sure it works with every other piece of the game. But I don't really decide what the story is. It's a collaborative process. It's done with the writing team, done with the other teams, done with the creative director. But I'm there to make sure that the parts of that touch narrative all work together, all work cohesively. Because, again, it's about process. We talk about games, it's about making sausage. Stuff that goes into sausage, sometimes you really don't want to know what it is. Sometimes you don't really think it's not something you really want to contemplate. But ultimately, you do need to make the sausage, and somebody needs to be grinding out that meat and putting it into the casings. There is no easy win button on narrative. If there were, we would have, every single BioWare game out there would have the most amazing narrative experience ever. And we don't always hit that. And sometimes it's about trial and error and seeing what works. But again, there are some guidelines, some things that we like to do, some things that I've adopted in my time as narrative director. And this really does come down to investment of time. It comes down to being willing to put the legwork in, put the blood, sweat, and tears in. So I'm going to go back to QA for a second. I mentioned earlier this was important. My time in QA is probably the best time, like for me, in terms of the career I have now, the place I'm in now, it is probably the most important job I had because it taught me to be the player champion. It taught me to take every department, work with every department, and represent and advocate for the user. Because ultimately, every game wants to be played, or you want someone to be playing the game that you're making. And whoever's playing that game needs someone on the team to advocate for them, because I can have the best idea in the world. I can have the most brilliantly crafted narrative and mechanics, everything's working together. And if you're a player, it straight up sucks. So you need somebody to advocate for the user, to be the person saying, hey, if I were playing this game, I might not actually like this thing that you think is the most brilliant thing ever. And that's why, again, QA is critical. And for me, being in QA taught me to do that. It taught me to really look at the game more holistically, look at it from the perspective of, I care about this experience as a whole. What is it that's important? What is it as a user that I would see here? And as narrative director, I put a Slack icon here because, again, right now, work from home, the reality of work from home is I spend a lot of time in Slack. When we were in the office, I spent most of my day away from my desk because either I'd be going to meetings, I'd be going to talk to people, I'd be having conversations with the coffee machine. All of this is important because, again, communication is critical. And as narrative director, I'm still here to champion the user, but it's a slightly different order of operations. Whereas as QA, I'm trying to make sure that the user experience is good and solid. As a narrative director, I'm trying to define what that user experience should be, and then figuring out the steps to get there and working with other departments and other teams to make sure that we're getting there on the narrative side of things. And I'm working with the art director, working with the design director, audio director, animation director, all the other director level people who all own a piece of that, and all comes, funnels back up to the creative director who ultimately sets that vision for the project. But I can say that on the time I've been at BioWare, all the jobs I've done, the time in QA was probably the most valuable and foundational for what I do now. And it's why, I will always, always, always hammer on the importance of QA, and especially embedded QA, because embedded QA means they're there with your team, they're part of the team, and they feel like they have a say that you don't always get when you're working with contract employees, because it's hard to get that feeling when you're not in the studio, you're not next to people. Because ultimately a game is all about the pieces. And I apologize to any of my colleagues who are seeing this. I'm sure I missed somebody, but this is the level of investment that goes into a single piece of content. These are all the people who have something to say, something to do with that content. And there are more. Yes, as I'm looking at this, I noticed I forgot to put in tech animation. I forgot to put in production. These are all groups that are also critical to building the game. And when you have that many different people, that many different disciplines, communication can start to fall apart. So what you want to do, especially what you need to do, is make sure these pieces are fitting together. The narrative experience is the sum of all these parts. So all that said, what are some practical examples of this? What are some places that we've done this? And for that, I'm going to go back to Dragon Age, which again, as the narrative director for, I feel like I can speak reasonably authoritatively for. Trespasser, if for anyone who doesn't know, was the last downloadable content pack for Dragon Age Inquisition. And in terms of fan engagement, in terms of just general reception, I would consider it to be the most successful Dragon Age DLC we've ever done. I worked on all the DA2 DLCs. I worked on Witch Hunt, and while they were all solid and all strong, Trespasser really felt like the ultimate expression of what we were trying to do with Dragon Age Inquisition. It was the best bits of that game, with the stuff that we found, after ship wasn't really working, pared down, and it told to me a satisfying and complete story, and it felt like a cohesive narrative experience. I worked on Jaws of Hakkon as well, and I was really proud of that DLC. I'm still very proud of that DLC, but that was much more of a less cohesive experience, because again, we were building the level, building the content, building the story, not quite in isolation, but without the level of communication and collaboration that I think we got to in Trespasser. It also had one of the best dev cycles I've ever been on. And that's not saying there was no crunch, because crunch is something that I try to avoid as much as possible. I don't like crunch. Trespasser had a little bit of it, but compared to other projects I've been on, it felt healthy. Everyone felt engaged. Everyone felt like they were part of something that they could get excited about. So all starts with a concept. Trespasser was one where we knew the story we wanted to tell from the start. Patrick Weeks, our lead writer, and I sat down and decided, okay, what is it that we want to do here? What story do you want to tell? There were a few pieces we wanted to hit. One was we wanted to put a bow on the Inquisition as much as we could. The Inquisition became this massive weight on the world, on the fabric of Thetis. We wanted to do something with it that felt like at least there was a resolution. Even if we didn't get rid of it, even if you chose not to dissolve it, we needed to put it in a place where it no longer felt like the most important thing in the world. We wanted to make sure we set up Solus as an antagonist. This was a big thing. We wanted to set up the future of Solus, and we wanted to raise the stakes. We wanted people to understand kind of what the idea of where we were going next. But again, that's just the story. That's not speaking about the narrative. The narrative was different. It's a lot broader, and this is where collaboration started. So we had to make sure every piece that we had available to us fit together. We had to work with all the different departments to figure out all the resource restrictions, because again, DLC is trickier in some ways than a main game. It's easier in others because, again, you've already built the core out. You already know kind of the baseline experience you're going for. You're not figuring out the answer to every single question. But ultimately, your resources are more limited. Your time is more limited, and you need to basically do it with a much smaller crew of people. So there are always going to be limitations. Again, the limitations in main game dev are also there. You're not like you have unlimited resources. One of the things I like to point out, there's people see AAA and like, oh, you could just spend all the money on all the people. But there is a very large gap between the two extremes of AAA. Some studios can spend, hundreds of millions, $1 billion on a product. Others cannot. And you always have to be aware of those constraints. And especially so, though, with DLC, because, again, much more limited product, much more limited expectation from your publisher of revenue. So you need to look at the pieces you've got. So our first step here, we got buy-in. We walked around, we talked to our gameplay designers, we talked to our character artists, we talked to our level artists, we talked to everybody on the team and basically said, okay, what do you have available? What are the pieces that you have currently available or you're planning on working on or you want to be able to build? And from that, we got our enemy palette, we got our level palette, and we got our gameplay, the gameplay changes that our gameplay team wanted to make. And we took all that and we said, okay, now this is going to be part of the pitch. We need to integrate this into the pitch that we're building. And when we built our first pitch, which wasn't quite on a napkin, but was literally in one of these smallest meeting rooms we had at the studio on a whiteboard, we took all those pieces, put them up, and said, okay, how do we make this all work together? And that was important because if we'd just gone ahead with our first story pitch, none of this stuff would have necessarily made it in, or we would have had to try to find ways to shove it in later, which if you're bringing stuff in later, especially into the story, you are going to find that it doesn't fit as well as you want it to. So now that you've had your initial idea, your initial story idea, and now you know what the inputs are, you need to make sure your pitch is structured around those inputs. So in our case, we wanted to make sure that, okay, we know we've got the Canary as an enemy palette because this was being built for a separate DLC that we never ended up making. We knew that our level artists wanted to build some spaces that were not that had some ancient elven architecture because this was a level design art palette that we had built for Temple of Mythal. We had a bunch of pieces, and in some cases, pieces we hadn't used nearly extensively. To go back to Jaws of Hakon, part of the reason why Jaws of Hakon centered around the barbarians, the Avar, was this had been a palette of enemies that had already been built for the main game, but we never really found an opportunity to use them. So a lot of DLC is just about, hey, say finding stuff that you've got and being like, hey, why don't we use this? How can we make an interesting experience around this? Trespasser was a little bit easier because we knew the story from the start, and this was a story-focused DLC. So all of these pieces taken together, Canary, Elven architecture, et cetera, if you could easily have made something very discordant and very inconsistent, but we wanted to work with those other departments, wanted to work with those other groups. So we took those things, those concepts, those ideas, and we structured them into our basic pitch. And our first pitch went out to the team, went out to our leads. Everyone signed off on it, and we knew, okay, this is the DLC we're going to make. This is the story we want to tell, and these are the pieces we're going to use to tell it. So next up, concept phase. Concept phase is where you get full buy-in from the team. They've heard your ideas. They've heard your pitch. They've given you their ideas, what they have available. Now is where you say, this is how we want it all to fit together. And this is where you really need to talk to your team and make sure everyone's on the same page. This is where everyone aligns to the same goal. It's also by far the cheapest place to iterate. It's not free. Obviously, you always have to, when you're reconcepting, when you're doing images, redoing text, you do still have to do it again, but it's cheap. It's cheaper compared to later phases where stuff has been built, assets have been built, and suddenly you're like, okay, well, this is actually going to cost us a month to do this. But work here, everything you do here, it's an investment in the future of the project, because if you do your work here, everything later on gets way, way easier. You shouldn't be figuring these questions, answering questions later on. You should be answering them as soon as you can. So first up, know your key themes, know your razors, know what it is that your game is being built around. And ultimately, you need to understand the concept of razors is a razor is there to cut stuff that doesn't fit. You use a razor as a statement. Okay, it's the X of Y, or we're doing this. This is critical. And when you look at your game, you look at your DLC, you say, okay, this doesn't fit, this doesn't fit, this doesn't fit. That might mean you need to readjust your razors, but more likely it means you need to cut that content because while it might be a great idea, while maybe something people are super excited about, it doesn't fit the product you're building right now. It doesn't fit the project you're building right now. And razors and themes are by their nature cross-discipline. This is something where you want to work with other groups to come up with your core project razors. You want to work with level art and figure, okay, what is it that's important to you? Work with gameplay and do the same thing. Every discipline is also going to have their own razors for their own content, but there's going to be some that apply to the project as a whole. So for us, we want to make sure we hung the DLC on these razors, on these themes. We had 4 big ones. The Canary incursion of Thetis. So the Canary were invading. No one really knew why. This was a big plot point as pretty early in the DLC. Solas's plan's now starting into motion. So Solas had left you at the end of the base game, and now we wanted to show what he'd been up to since he left. The Inquisition. as mentioned before, we really wanted to take the Inquisition and put a bow on it. And the Inquisition at this point was a ponderous and overly powerful entity. The Exalted Council that you went to in Trespasser was all about R.L. Tegan from Ferelden basically telling you what you didn't want to hear, which was the Inquisition is no longer under your control. It's now so big that it acts without your input as a player. And as the Inquisitor, you're supposed to be the hero. So it's not really a great feeling when you see that the organization you founded is now doing things without your knowledge, without your consent. And we also wanted to give a good, strong conclusion to the Inquisitor's story arc. The Inquisitor was the hero for all of Inquisition. They had a magic hand, and we really wanted to put a bow on that story of the Inquisitor. Anyone who's seen our GDC presentation from 4 years ago, this is like, again, speaking to the same stuff, but this is how we built this DLC. And then we took those racers, we refocused, and we looked at some of the stuff in our early pitch. So there were some things that didn't really work. We had the idea of Canary Templars, which as we got deeper, we're like, this doesn't actually make any sense and also doesn't really fit with anything. Some content that we built for some enemy types, some specific environments didn't really fit the theme, so we cut it. And again, sometimes the best idea is the one you don't actually build. You want to be able to let stuff go. You want to be able to look at stuff and like, okay, is this actually the game we're trying to make? Is this actually fitting the themes of this project? Or am I just really, really excited about this and I really want to make this thing and I don't actually have a strong reason for doing so? And doing this, cutting stuff early makes the entire experience feel a lot tighter. It makes you feel a lot more like there's something cohesive, that everything is starting to work together. Qunari were a great example of this. Qunari are supposed to be powerful warriors. They've almost conquered Thedas before. We wanted you as the top high-level Inquisitor, because by this time you'd gone through the main campaign, you would have gotten the best gear. We still wanted them to feel like a credible threat. This could not be a group that you steamrolled whenever you saw them. This could not be a group where anytime you fought them, you absolutely smoked them, because, again, we wanted them to feel powerful. This needs to feel like a credible threat to Thedas. This needs to feel like if I don't stop them, they will easily take over Thedas, because I'm having trouble with them, and I'm one of the best fighters around. How is everybody else going to deal with them? So we worked with gameplay closely. We wanted them to feel strong. We wanted them to feel different from the factions you fought before. So they were much more focused on range. They were Javelineers, and they had the Cerebus, the Qunari mages, who just would absolutely wreck the battlefield if you didn't deal with them. This is how we made them feel like, okay, this is different. This isn't just a Templar with a different skin. This isn't just a mage with a different coat of paint. This is something new and dangerous, and really played into the core of the DLC, which was the Qunari are coming. You need to stop them, because if you don't, they will absolutely take over this world. The Elves were another one. The Elves were supposed to, in our lore, are a once powerful civilization that's fallen into disrepair and decay. And we really wanted that to feel like you need to understand where they came from, what this history was. But we wanted you to feel some sympathy for them. We wanted you to feel like, okay, they may have had some real jerks at the top, but as a people, there is something tragic about the collapse of their civilization. So we worked with level art. We built the Broken Library in the Fade, the Crossroads, which was the sense of this is a place where they store their information. And back in the day, it was beautiful and grand and had all the information you could ever ask for. And now it's not. And now it's crumbling. Now it's falling apart. This is about the decay of the Elves. So you felt that sense of, okay, when you ultimately ran into Solus at the end, he told you his plan. You get where he's coming from. It's not that just that he's a selfish, genocidal jerk. It's that he has a civilization that he was part of that collapsed in large part because of his hubris. And so you kind of get that sense of sympathy for them. You may still not like them. You may still not like Solus. A lot of players don't. But you at least understood where he's coming from. And this was, again, a collaboration between narrative, between writing and level art and the other disciplines to make sure that they felt like this collapsed civilization. Inquisition. Now, the Inquisition aspect of this was a little bit more focused on the story stuff because, again, the Inquisition, the Exalted March, or the Exalted Council was something that was largely done through cutscenes, through conversations, but it was the backbone of the entire DLC. This was happening in the background. All this was happening as somebody was telling you, your organization is too powerful and too large. You have no idea what's going on. We really need to get you under control. And as you go through the DLC, as you see people doing things on their own, as you see the traitors that are able to infiltrate your organization because it's so big, you start to think maybe they have a point. And we wanted to make it clear that without you, the Inquisition was dangerous. If you die in this story, if your mark kills you, because that was another thing, your mark is starting to act up at the beginning of the DLC, that's it. The Inquisition without you is a massively dangerous entity. And again, the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor's mark was killing them, but it also gave them a power and strength that they didn't normally have because you could channel that energy into various attacks. And this was actually a great collaboration with gameplay. They had a lot of great ideas for how they wanted to deal with the mark, and we were able to take them and really fold them into the story in a way that we might not have been able to do if we hadn't been working so closely together. If we hadn't had these daily syncs, these daily conversations, and just been able to see what everybody's working on. And ultimately, we made it clear also, this also tied into how powerful Solus was, because this was a thing Solus was able to deal with basically a snap of his fingers. And the entire DLC, it's both killing you and also you're using it to kill everyone else. So for him to have that level of power was something that came across by having gameplay and narrative working closely together. So now, you got your themes, you've cut what fits, you've gotten everything, you think you know what you're building now. Reconcept. I say reconcept, it's not actually doing your entire concept phases, but it's about finding the places where things have changed dramatically and redoing your concept on those, because you want to make sure you're catching all of the bits that didn't exist before, making sure they all still fit together, because a lot of your previous work will be preserved. You're not going to throw out everything you did. You're not deleting pages and pages of concept art. You're not deleting massive amounts of level art, but you want to make sure that the pieces that you have are still working together, are still fitting. And reconcepting lets you do that. It lets you take the things that have changed the most dramatically, make sure they still work as part of the whole. And now prototype everything. Prototyping is the next cheapest time to blow things up. It's more expensive than concept because now you're actually building assets, you're putting things in engine, but you want to make sure everything exists. That means that you want to be able to play through your piece of content, play through your DLC, your game, from beginning to end, and see representations of everything that exists, all the systems, because maybe you have the best idea in the world for a crafting system. Once you put it in the game, you realize, oh man, this is so discordant from the rest of the game. This does not feel like a natural part of this. Prototyping lets you see that in a way that you may not be able to see otherwise. And prototyping is a thing that everybody should be doing, because this is stuff like gray boxing, stubbing in content. This lets you nail down flow pretty quickly, because flow is tricky. Flow is honestly, I've been doing games for 13 years. Flow is the hardest thing to do, because especially in games, you have so many different disciplines that are part of it, or creating content, putting stuff in. It's very easy to go from, the phrase ludonarrative dissonance is one that's fallen a little bit out of favor, but I still love it, because it speaks to the fact that you're playing a game about how you are this, moral person who doesn't kill anyone, and then you go to combat, you kill 40 guys. Yakuza, I love the Yakuza games, because as I make the joke, nobody can prove that Kiryu has killed anyone, because you never actually see him kill someone on screen. Obviously, that gets a little trickier when you get into the sequences where you're fighting on the back of a truck, you kick a guy off, and then the semi-truck wheel rolls over their head. But technically, they didn't die on screen, so, it still holds. But prototyping lets you nail down flow. It also exposes problems and opportunities, places where you're like, oh, I didn't realize that there was a space here. I can think of something that works really, really well in this space. And experiential flow, that's part of prototyping, but it's where you take all the various prototypes and you make sure that they all tie together. You start connecting them. This is where you can play the entire experience from start to finish, and you start to see where things are fitting together, and importantly, where they aren't fitting together. We're like, oh, I completely forgot to tell the player this important thing that's going to be critical for them to understand this plot point later. Okay, now I need to put a beat in here. And this is also a great time to take stock of the tools you have. So all the gameplay elements, all the art elements, everything that people have been building, this is where you start to looking like, okay, now I know my tool chest a little bit better. I understand what I've got. Now I can start working with teams to take those tools and really arrange them in the best way possible. However, solving one gap can introduce other gaps, or it can widen gaps that already existed. So this comes razor time again. Go back to your razors, go back to your themes. Okay, everything that we've added, everything we've changed, does it all still fit? Does it all still match? And you want to work with other disciplines and start aligning to cut the things that aren't fitting, that aren't working, because a common problem in game development is something I've done myself, I know lots of people have, is you end up solving one problem and introducing three others, because you solve problems by adding more stuff. Okay, this isn't working, let's add a cutscene here. This isn't working, and at the end of it, you realize, oh shoot, I made this way more complicated and way worse than it needed to be. So this is a great opportunity to look at it like, okay, do I actually need all this stuff I've added, or can I cut it down and get something tighter and more cohesive and better paced? Because ultimately, your first solution isn't always going to be your best one. It's good to solve it, but you should always make sure your solutions aren't making more problems than they're solving. And this is, again, where communication is critical. And this is where, for myself as an narrative director, my job is the most important is I make sure everyone's talking to each other, and facilitating that communication as a leader, or even as someone on the team, is critical. Daily, weekly syncs. You want to make sure that they're regular but not too obtrusive. You don't want to be like, hey, everyone, let's meet for 25 minutes every day at 11:30 a.m. Because at a certain point, it loses its valuableness. And especially as you get into development, you want to keep those touch points a little bit less frequent. But part of that involves having those informal lines of communication that are open, because you may not have a formal meeting, but you're like, oh, shoot, this thing's not working. I'm just going to ping this levelers real quick because I've been working with them for the last 6 months, and make sure that they're, talk to them about how we're going to solve this. That's where the team starts communicating with each other. And as a lead, as a director, you start to kind of dial it back a little bit. You take away the formality and you trust your team to communicate with each other. And you just keep an eye out for siloing. Siloing is where one group or one person will kind of do their own thing, isolated from the rest of the team. And then when that stuff comes in, it tends to be discorded. You just want to make sure that's not happening. And now you move to building it for real. This is where you move from the larger concept and prototype phase to actual creation. Now your biggest hurdle, your biggest limitation is technical. So you might be like, oh, I really, really want to tell the story beat, but oh, our engine doesn't actually allow me to do this. Our engine doesn't allow for realistically flowing lava, so I can no longer do the sequence where you run away from a lava flow. So you need to be willing to adapt to those changing circumstances. And again, when you're solving these problems and you're finding solutions to these technical hurdles, know your razors, know your themes, and make sure that you have a strong understanding of the game you're building, this experience you're building, and then use those razors and themes to align those solutions to technical hurdles back to the core game experiences. And connective tissue is also great at solving problems. Connective tissue is what we describe as anything that's not a mission or everything that exists in between the major beats. And this is where you start identifying new gaps. Trespasser was no different. We had each level was very focused on one specific beat of the story. And when we put it all in, we looked at like, oh, shoot, we're missing some information flow here. The players are going to get confused, or this experience isn't really landing the way we want it to. And that's where you start getting into connective tissue, and you start doing, okay, we need a cutscene here between these two beats to transition from this emotion to this emotion, or transition from this gameplay concept to this gameplay concept. A DLC where you fight ancient elves in one level, Canary in another, Darkspawn in a third, could come across as very discordant and unharmonious, but connective tissue lets you really smooth that over, start connecting those pieces in some type of cases the cheapest possible way, which can be a cutscene, can just be literally text on the screen that says, hey, the Canary are doing this, you should probably go stop them. But connective tissue becomes critical, and you don't really identify connective tissue issues until you can play through the entire experience. And it's critical because, again, you will not solve these problems in the abstract. You can be the most brilliant developer in the world. You can be the most brilliant narrative director in the world. Until you've actually got stuff in, you're still going to be missing problems. You can solve some of this by doing things like prototyping in Twine. Something we've done is we built our story beats in Twine, had people play through them, say, hey, how is this feeling? And this actually becomes great because then they can identify these problems and tell you, hey, I completely lost track of what I was doing here. And even if you're not able to build the levels yet or build the content, you can already start identifying these problems. Because again, playable means a lot of different things. It doesn't necessarily just mean I go into the game and everything's working, all the combat's working. It can be, okay, I'm trying to solve a story problem. So the most important thing here is to understand the story. You'll still need to do a pass when the gameplay is actually in, because again, gameplay can affect a lot of the narrative. And the idea of a cohesive narrative experience is each element does not sit separate from each other. But early on, you can start figuring these things out for each discipline themselves by having a strong prototyping and concepting phase. But yeah, it's important that everybody plays the game. This is something that we, again, push on. This is where we talked about earlier, having your writers in-house versus having them contract. Is if you have in-house writers, get them playing the game. And this is true across every discipline. Get people playing the game and seeing how the pieces that they're building fit together, because they can see problems and opportunities that other people might not even have seen. They can see like, hey, you did this thing here, but actually if we go to this story beat or we go to this gameplay mechanic, I can make that work way more inexpensively and way better for the player. This is where playing the game becomes critical because, again, you find opportunities, you find problems. And as a director, as a lead, it's especially important to play the game because otherwise you end up getting into this weird eagle's eye view where you don't really see all the smaller problems. You just see the big picture, and that's not always the best. But again, trust your experts. If you're a director, you're a lead, it's really tempting. And I know I've had this temptation to get super involved. Like, oh, but what if you did this? The phrase that I've been using and that I think is applicable is just because it's not the solution you would have chosen doesn't mean it's a bad solution. If you're a leader, director, know the difference between this doesn't work and this isn't what I would have done, because I think you'll find a lot of the time, and I know I have found it, it's more about, it's not what I would have done more than, it's not working. And it's not what I would have done isn't a bad thing, because it's not you who's doing it. It's your team who's doing it. You need to be there to trust your team. You need to be there as a tiebreaker for when different disciplines disagree. But ultimately, momentum is your friend. Trust that your team's able to do it and be there to solve problems, remove roadblocks, but let them work. And again, playing through the build also helps expose flaws. Some stuff you think works super well. This is going to be the most brilliant. People are going to love it. I cannot wait till they see it. And then you play it and you're like, well, that actually sucked. And I mean, I'm personally responsible for at least 3 things that have not worked as well as they should have. Trespasser, we definitely had places where like, this is going to be great. And we played like, well, okay, this was not the best idea we've ever had. But again, it's important to play through the build to see these things, because you may not see them in the abstract. And that's where the culture of respectful feedback comes in. And this is one of the hardest lessons I ever had to learn in game development, is just because somebody doesn't like the thing you're building doesn't mean they don't like you. Creating a culture where people can say, hey, this thing's not working for me, and people don't take it personally, absolutely critical. It's how a team becomes self-correcting, because once you get that feeling of respectful, the culture of respectful feedback in your team, they can talk to each other. They can correct the problems themselves, because they know that when someone comes to them saying, hey, this thing you did, I don't think it worked, it's not because that person's out to get them or out to take their job. It's because they're trying to make the best game possible. And again, if you're a director in your leadership position, it's so critical to lead by example. Be open to feedback, be open to criticism. This is how you get to a cohesive experience, because you're leading by example, which means everyone else is trusting that if you're doing this, they can do it too. They can hear, hey, this idea you built, a level artist can hear from a writer, this isn't really working. A writer can hear from a game designer, this isn't working. And everyone will take it in the spirit in which it's offered, which is not, I'm going to tell you how to do your job, but hey, from my perspective on this department, I'm seeing how this isn't really fitting with the experience we're trying to build. And it's how everyone gets something they're proud of. And then the most important lesson is let it end. Finishing a game, as I said before, is a miracle. Any game that gets to store shelves is by itself a miracle. There's always one little thing, one little touch, one little tweak. But at a certain point, you need to just be willing to let it go and let it finish, because the road to success should be visible. If you've done your pre-production work properly, you've done your concept work properly, you should be able to see where success is going to come from on this. And trust your team, trust your experience, and just put a cap on it, let it finish. And by this point, you should have something that everyone can be proud of and that works together well. So with that, we're 47 minutes in. Thank you all for coming to this talk. And I think it's now time for questions.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing your experience. I especially love the slide about feedback. Unfortunately, there were some issues with the stream at the beginning of the lecture, but it's because everyone will have the recording of the stream without these issues, so you'll be able to watch everything. So it's time for questions. While the chat is still thinking about them, I have a couple.
Sure.
The first is, how do you personally brainstorm, and what's the best way for you? Because people are always looking for new ways to brainstorm.
Oh, I mean, for me, brainstorm, I bring up a Word document and I just throw words and ideas down as they come to me. Or as a team, like if we're doing collaborative brainstorming, we'll just bring up a Word document and we'll say, okay, we need to solve for X. And then you just write everything down. And then you go through it a second time, like, okay, what stuff here is standing out to everyone? What stuff here is working the best? And then you start winnowing out the ideas that aren't working, the ideas that maybe don't get there. But I think for me, it's basically, it's a funnel. It starts out wide. It starts out like, let's get everything in there. And then as you narrow down, you usually come up with something that's not exactly any one person's idea, but it ends up being the best idea that as a team, you all realize the strengths of it, and everyone adds their own perspective and adds their own little bit of input, their own expertise to it. So, but yeah, for me, Word document is literally it. I know there's a lot of brainstorming software out there. I know a lot of people I work with use it, and I'm sure it's fantastic. My brain doesn't work that way. My brain is a chaotic mess most of the time. So a Word document where I throw words on a paper, as it were, works the best for me.
Thank you. The next question is, what prototyping tools do you use, and do you prototype using the game engine?
So yeah, we mostly prototype using the game engine, especially for gameplay, level design, level art. But for myself, like we have used other external tools before. We've looked at Twine, things like that, for figuring out flow and figuring out how story beats are working together, how information flow is working. So I said before, pacing is really tricky. That becomes a big thing. Like, okay, it's harder to do in Twine because there's not the gameplay in between, but you can at least get an idea like, oh, wow, I refer to them as capital letter words. I just dropped a bunch of capital letter words on the player. And capital letter words for me are any word that is specific to a lore concept or something that you're trying to introduce the player to that's not immediately understandable or coherent. So Dragon Age has a lot of capital letter words. If you start your game and you're like, okay, let's talk about the Blight, capital B. Let's talk about the Fade, capital F. Let's talk about the Veil, capital V. Let's talk about the Templars, capital T. And suddenly, as a player, if especially someone who's not familiar with the franchise, you're asking them to take in a lot of information. So prototyping lets us, in something like Twine or any other linear or non-linear narrative tool, lets us look and be like, okay, am I asking the player to carry too much information here? And one of our writers has the phrase, "You're asking a monkey to juggle too many bananas." We don't use it because because not everyone on our team likes monkeys or bananas, but it's that concept of how much am I asking the player to retain? And prototyping, especially for narrative, can let you solve that. And then when it comes to design and art prototyping lets you very quickly and very dirtily get out the best ideas. So the concept of box creatures. Okay, this is a creature that's made entirely out of boxes. It doesn't animate really. It just kind of swings. Is the gameplay fun? Because if you can make it fun with no art and no VFX, you know you're onto something.
Thank you. The next question is from Ainura. It's how to foreshadow endings or outcomes without giving away too much.
So a lot of it comes down to if you're trying to foreshadow an ending, foreshadow an outcome, the thing that you don't want to give away is the specific details, but you can start to figure out themes, figure out things about it that are not going to, that if in retrospect, and this is a hard question to answer because it's not always going to, it doesn't always work, but I find that if you find, okay, this is a detail, a double speak maybe is a better way of putting it. Does this thing mean two things? If I say it now, is it innocuous enough that anyone who sees it is going to think it means the thing, a specific moment, and later on it means something different? I wasn't a BioWare for this, but like for me, the Revan twist was maybe I was just very bad at understanding what was going on, but I didn't figure out the Revan twist till it came. Like, oh my god, this blew my mind, and it was because every word that they talked about Revan, every word that they talked about you, they always used language that, retrospect, was super obviously pointing to it, but in the moment you didn't really get. Actually, another one was Jade Empire. The whole twist around your master being actually the bad guy was, again, a lot of stuff he said had double meanings, but because you didn't have the context necessary to get the second meaning, it didn't work as a spoiler. If you've been given that context, you've been told like this is what this, the way of the closed fist means, this, etc., you would have known that, but they very explicitly did not give you that context till later. So yeah, maybe that's the better answer. It's about context. Context can then jump back to stuff that that was very specific, but it's also just, again, about the distinction between the details and maybe more the themes, if that makes sense.
Thank you. We have time for maybe two more questions. One is, you mentioned a prototype for the narrative for the DLC. Did you throw it out? Or did you polish and release it?
And it depends. It really depends on the disciplines. So some disciplines, like our animation and the way animation works in the Frostbite and so on, meant that a lot of that work was able to be retained. There was not a need to throw it out completely and blow it up. Other prototypes, if you're trying to prototype out how a level lighting works and things like that, you're largely going to be building a specific environment to answer those questions. And sometimes the environment you build to answer questions quickly is not going to be the same thing that you build to actually make a solid game. So again, it does come down to the specifics of what you're prototyping, but we try to retain prototype work as much as possible. We try to build our prototypes in a way that it's not all throwaway, and that can give you a big leg up as you get into actual development, because you're no longer building everything from scratch. You're building from a solid base. And sometimes that base literally is just, oh, we know the idea that we're trying to get to, but a lot of the time there is actual concrete work you can retain.
And finally, we have a question from Max. It's, what's your favorite quest in the Inquisition?
My favorite quest in Inquisition? Oh, man. It's funny because I don't actually have a favorite quest. I think there's certain quests we reference a lot as like, yep, that was a quest we did, and we built it for a very specific purpose, and it was not great, and we're never going to do it again. And that's my favorite, largely from the, it serves a purpose for the larger narrative of game development. But I think the one that worked for me the best, the thing that I loved the most, was what is so, and I don't remember the name for it. It was Patrick Weeks, our lead writer, wrote the name is an anagram. And I can't remember the name of it specifically, but anyways, it's a quest where you basically go out into the you speak to an elven spirit that basically is speaking in ancient elven, and it's funny because I'm trying to think back to DAI, and it's so long ago, and it feels like a lot of that game is crested over my. Actually, no. Let me change. My favorite quest that I worked on was Iron Bull and the Chargers, because we were able to pay that quest off in a way that was so. And this actually comes down to the point about finding opportunities. It was never planned for Iron Bull to betray you in Trespasser. This came out of one of our level designers being like, "Hey, wouldn't it be awesome if?" And then Iron Bull comes and betrays you if you decide to sacrifice the Chargers. I love that quest because I'm not saying there was a right answer and a wrong answer, but I'm saying that there's a canonically right answer, which is you don't sacrifice the Chargers. They're Iron Bull's best buds, and they're dead. Iron Bull, of course, is going to turn mopey. But to me, that was the one where it felt the most. It looked the most like we were planning something really brilliant down the line that we then paid off. But in reality, that was a quest that we built, and then later on, we found an opportunity to use it. So that would be probably my favorite quest in DAI.
Thank you. Actually, I came up with the question of myself. Do you track the decisions players make in dialogues and quests?
Oh yeah, I mean so every decision that's made is put into the your plot state, and we try to keep. We don't carry forward every single decision and every single thing. Like, okay, are we ever going to reference this again? Are we ever going to do anything with this? We were much more ambitious at the beginning, and then we realized that we never really had the ability to pay off stuff like, did you feed the prisoner in Ostagar? Great important moral decision in the game. We're probably he's never going to show up again, likely. So,
sorry, what I meant was, do you track it as, do you collect analytics from?
Oh, so we haven't done a great job in the past of doing that, and that's because our analytics was a little bit more rudimentary, but it's definitely something we try to do, and we try to use analytics as much as possible, just understand what players do. And so I can't speak to the specifics of it right now because I haven't been involved in analytics since DAI, but this stuff that gets tracked is really great for us for like, okay, identifying player patterns, identifying player engagement, and then really realizing what it is that our players are engaging with. So yes, we do that, not as much as we'd like to in the past, but definitely something we want to do more in the future.
All right. Thank you very much for your answers. It's time to end. Hope to see you again. And thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.